Hi, everybody. You're listening to the Oneness Junkie podcast, hosted by me, Lydia Smith, a self-proclaimed Oneness Junkie. Oneness Junkie is a place to be inspired, encouraged, and supported. Learn from the individuals who are working to make the world a better place. Let's meet today's guest. Hi, everybody. It's Lydia from the Oneness Junkie podcast and YouTube channel. And today I have an exciting guest. I'm so curious to learn what all he knows about the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And for any of y'all who have been listening to any of my other episodes, you know that the Oneness Junkie podcast is really focused on personal healing and personal growth. And the reason that I'm doing that, aside from highlighting people who are doing work to help the world be a much better place, I see the connection to the practitioners who are helping with the healing that helps the individual become more of who they're meant to be. And when they get to that place, they become happier. In my opinion, that creates more compassion, more acceptance and tolerance in the world. And really, I think I say, when you heal yourself, you heal the world. And so that's why I have Jonathan on the show today. So I'm going to let him introduce himself, but he is Jonathan Schecter with the Vital Point podcast. And before he introduces himself, I'm just going to share that I like to mention if I know previously or if I don't know my guest. And today I do not know Jonathan, so I'm going to be getting to know him with you on this call. But we did have a pre-call and I got to meet him and talk about what we wanted to bring to the audience today. And I think it's a really important topic that actually a lot of people are kind of curious about, because I think that it's not really well known what it is that he has to share with the world. So, Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself and give us a little background about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Lydia. My name is Jonathan Schecter. I'm a breathwork facilitator and integration and transformation coach. And so there's a lot there, right? And I think we had talked about kind of starting about like how I got into this work or kind of how I got here. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I had kind of like my first spiritual experience right after my grandmother died, and I watched her. I was with her when she passed, and that in itself was kind of a spiritual experience. And then the next day, I was in a bookstore, and I never read any sort of nonfiction. At the time, I only read fiction books, and I was still like feeling this presence that I had, kind of experienced and felt since her physical body passed. And I was raised Jewish, but I was in this bookstore and I felt this presence like actually physically stop me. And it was telling me, you need to go down this aisle. And I was like, okay. And I didn't know what was happening, but I went down this aisle, and it was like the aisle of spirituality, spiritual books. And it led me directly to this aisle with books about Buddhism. And I picked up this book, and it was like a magnet, like drawing me to this particular book. And I picked it up, and like the first thing that I read was, Buddhism is about experience. Like, don't just believe something because anybody tells you, even if it's the Buddha. Go and experience it for yourself. And then you'll want to continue to practice because you've had this direct experience yourself. And that led me into meditation. It led me into, further into exploring Buddhism. And within a couple of years, I ended up going to Tibet for a year to study Tibetan and to teach English. I ended up living for most of that year in my main teacher's monastery at about 13,000 feet no running water or electricity, and just in a very like holy spiritual place, and really amazing place where like you didn't really have to even try to meditate so much. Like as you know, as soon as you sat down and started to pay attention to your breath, you would just drop into this like really deep place just because of the energy, and the other practitioners that had been putting that energy into, you know, that area for, you know, at least 1,000 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So the other thing that happened when I went over there, before I ended up going to the monastery, was I met the woman that I would end up getting married to. And that's a very important part of the story, especially for like where I am here in terms of a breathwork facilitator and integration coach. When I came back to the States, I ended up coming to Arizona. That's where I live now, in Tucson. And you know, continuing that relationship with her, we ended up getting married. And over the course of the marriage, she started to have some sexual trauma from her childhood start to come forth that had been, you know, suppressed by medication, and just, you know, things like that aren't always known in our conscious mind. And she didn't really know how to handle it. I didn't know how to handle it either. I didn't know how to support her. And things started to progressively get worse. She started to have seizures. And it was interesting because we were going to all these doctors, and the doctors would say, "Do you have any childhood trauma?" And she would say, "No," because that
She
was
wasn't aware.
right. Yeah, that was true for her, you know. And it ended up, you know, I'm advancing the story. I'm trying to condense, but she ended up trying to commit suicide, because she really couldn't handle what was happening. I didn't know how to handle that either. We didn't talk about it for over a year after it happened. And uh, in the aftermath of that, uh, our relationship continued to kind of get strained. She started to drink a lot to try to kind of handle what was happening, and started,
Just to cope.
yeah, right, trying to cope. But in as a part of that, she also started to become very abusive emotionally and sometimes physically towards me. Um, and I really didn't know what to do. I didn't have any resources outside of my meditation practice. And to be completely honest, I had let that meditation practice lapse a lot since that time living in Tibet. You know, I was working as a retail grocery manager, and I was trying to work on music, and sort of had gone back to kind of like a quote unquote like normal, you know, normal life. And so I really didn't have any resources to deal with it. I didn't know how to leave. I definitely knew I wasn't happy in the situation, and I ended up going back into therapy after marriage counseling didn't really pan out. And I also rededicated myself to my meditation practice. And within a year of those two things, I ended up leaving the marriage after, you know, really trying to reconcile and
Yeah,
make
you
it
did
work.
everything you could.
I did, you know, and one of the things that I learned was how to set boundaries. You know, like that was something that wasn't necessarily modeled very well in my family growing up.
Right.
So I
Or
just kind of,
taught, not only modeled, but probably taught.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, I just kind of thought that I had to stay there and stick it out, and got to the place where I said, no, I have to leave for me. And when I left, you know, even though I felt like, okay, here's this abusive situation I'm, you know, decoupling myself from. And while I feel like I didn't deserve that, I also have to take some sort of responsibility for being the other person in this relationship, for staying as long as I did, for you know, being part of this dysfunctional relationship. And so there's things that I need to fix within myself, if so that for the very, you know, at the very least, I don't end up picking the same type of a partner. I don't want to end up in the same situation again.
Yeah, you can see the signs more quickly now.
Yeah, so I really went on this journey of self-discovery and personal development, kind of at my lowest. And one of the first things that happened that sort of kicked off a lot of other things that ended up growing and blooming was I had the opportunity to work with a type of psychedelic medicine called 5-MeO DMT, which
Wow.
comes from the bufo. It's a bufo, like the Colorado river toads that live native to Tucson and the Sonora, Mexico area.
Wow.
It's one of the strongest psychedelics known to man. It's very, very powerful.
And do they grow wild? Just you can go out and find them out.
Yeah, during the monsoon season, you can actually, if you know where to go, you can go and find them. But I found a practitioner that was skilled in kind of guiding people through this journey, and it was right at the beginning of me saying like, okay, I need to find these ways to help and to change, and so I was starting to get involved in ice baths and cold exposure, and I was definitely meditating and journaling and starting to go into sweat lodges. And I had several very transformative experiences with mushrooms and with some other psychedelics in more of a recreational way, but it had this big impact on me. And so one of the things that I was kind of keen to look into, like I was curious about, was ayahuasca. And so but really the 5-MeO experience kicked off a lot of this stuff. I ended up I feel like it opened the door energetically to a lot of other things.
Can't wait.
And
Can you, I mean, I
yeah.
know you're in your intro, but can you just
Mhm.
explain to the listeners who have no idea what you're talking about? That's a
Yeah.
big word, what
Mhm.
you described of that mushroom. Can you just
Mhm.
explain what a psychedelic is and how it affects you? And then we'll continue with where you're at today.
Yeah. So, psychedelics. I mean, obviously, there are things like LSD and ketamine and things that are coming from a more chemical basis, but the majority of psychedelics are plant based, and there are medicinal plants or substances that have been used by different indigenous cultures for thousands of years in order to open themselves up to spirit, to open themselves up to an expanded state of consciousness. And as we're starting to find out with neuroscience and modern being able to test and see what's happening in the brain, there's actually neurogenesis, neuroscientific things that are happening within the brain when we ingest these sacred molecules and work with them in an environment that's safe, that we've prepared ourselves for. So we're in an interesting time right now where like a lot of people, when they think of psychedelic mushrooms, for instance, they may have had like an experience in high school where maybe they went out into the woods with some friends, or they were at a party, or going to a concert and had some mushrooms, and they saw some colors, or everything got a little bit giggly. This isn't really what I'm talking about. And one of the things that I do with my clients is help prepare them to work with these substances in a way that's therapeutic. And one of the main ways that we do that is by really focusing on set and setting. If you start to get involved with anything around psychedelics, you're going to hear these two words frequently. So, setting obviously is like the external environment, where you're taking it, what's around it, what you have kind of prepared, and then set is your mindset. So, like how are you approaching this experience? And then I actually like to talk about a third set. And this is something that I help my clients with. That third set is the skill set that you bring to the experience. Things like mindfulness, like breath work. So, skills that you can have so that when you go into these experiences, you can stay as grounded and present as possible so that you can work and regulate your nervous system. Because oftentimes, especially if you're working with these substances for healing, there's energy that's stored in our body and it's going to come out, and that's not always the most comfortable thing, regardless of the modality that you're using, right? Like if you're going into a sweat lodge for healing, if you're doing yoga for healing, you might have some emotional kind of material coming out, and it's definitely something that comes up with breath work, which we'll get into as well. uh, so yeah, this tool belt, this skill set of different things that you can use to regulate your nervous system, to stay calm, is another really important thing for doing this work.
Yeah. So bring us to the point of where all of that background brought you
Yeah.
to what you're doing today.
Yeah. So, like as I started to kind of sit in these ceremonies, that one of the big things that kept coming up was integration. And, well, what is integration? Integration is making two things whole, bringing two separate things together. So, as you're working with these different medicines, you're in an expanded state, and then you have to kind of go back to your normal life. And what I saw other people, and I actually experienced it myself, was that you come off of these oftentimes very blissful experiences where you have a lot of insight. You might have seen certain things that oh yes, this is what I want, this is what I want to do, this is what I need to change. It's very clear in the experience
Like
of like,
insights.
right, or downloads, or you might have visions that really show you very clearly this is what needs to change. And you come out of the experience like fully energized and like ready to do that. And then, you go back to work, or you go back into the relationships, that you're around that aren't necessarily like serving this new vision that you want, or you go back to eating the same way. You have everybody has habits and behaviors that we've kind of built up, and part of the reason that we have those habits and behaviors is because we're trying to cope with things, in our own way, right? And so there's this very frustrating thing that happens to a lot of people, and I would see it where that clarity of those visions, or the insights that they got, start to fade, and then all of a sudden they found themselves back sort of at square one. And maybe they're like, okay, well, now I need to go back and sit with have another psychedelic experience. And if that happens, you're just kind of going on this hamster wheel, right? And so integration is the practices that help you kind of break out of that hamster wheel. It's like, how can I take those insights, those visions, those things that I saw that I wanted to change, and actually bring it into the rest of my life?
Right. The awareness.
Right. So, one of the things that I was blessed enough to kind of be exposed to really early on in this process was breath work as a form of integration. And I was very skeptical about it at first. Actually, when I was a teenager and starting to get into, drugs and different psychedelics and getting into a lot of trouble, my dad tried to sit me down and tell me about breath work. And he
Wow.
said like, yeah, I know you think you know what you're doing, and that you're, exploring these new, realms of consciousness, but you can get just as high doing breath work as you can.
That's amazing that your dad knew that.
Yeah, he practiced a type of breath work called rebirthing with Leonard Orr. And he had done that, unbeknownst to me, since before I was born. And at the time, I wasn't ready to hear him. I was like, oh, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about,
Right.
But this thing started to come up again in my consciousness of like, oh, you should try breath work. It's really, really good for integration, for continuing to explore this work. And so I said, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen, right? And when I started doing breath work, I literally started to have these very psychedelic type of experiences, but in a much more grounded way. Like if you take mushrooms or you take ayahuasca, you're sort of giving you're giving that time away, like where you can't like say like, okay, I changed my mind, like let's just stop now, like this is too much, right? You're kind of on this roller
You
coaster
can't
for
stop it.
hours and hours, and you've got to be there and deal with it. Whereas
Wait,
with
how long does it last for those of us who've never done it?
I mean, depending on what medicine you're working with, between 4 and 8 hours.
Okay.
So
So it's
yeah, it
an
can be,
all-day thing.
yeah, it can be a long time. With breath work, you can be in this very expanded state that's very, very similar to like a psychedelic. And if it gets too overwhelming, you can just bring your breath back to normal, and within a few minutes, you're back. You
Yeah.
know, so it's very accessible for people, not only that maybe are concerned about the legality or the safety of working with these different medicines, but also like to introduce them to that expanded state. And I mentioned earlier that the neurogenesis and the neuroscience. So one of the things that's coming out right now in terms of the research that's being done, and if you're familiar with Michael Pollan's book and now Netflix series, How to Change Your Mind, he talks about this. When somebody takes a psychedelic, and similarly when they do this type of breath work that I facilitate, one of the things that happens is that the part of the brain that we call the default mode network, which is a part of our prefrontal cortex that is in charge of, you might say, the ego. Like you might call it the ego. It's sort of our sense of self. It's how we think about ourselves in autobiographical memories. And also when we think of ourselves, like when we project ourselves into the future, that's the part of the brain that's like lighting up and kind of in control of that. But when we work with these substances, or when we do breath work, that part of the brain quiets down and there's less activity going into it. When that happens, from a breathwork perspective, we all have an inner healer, an inner intelligence that has a chance to emerge. With if depending on the sort of like wisdom tradition of the psychedelic you're working with, they might talk about like connecting to the spirit of the plant. From a neuroscience perspective, what these things are that are happening is that as that default mode network quiets down, we actually have the opportunity to make new neural connections in the brain. So, neuroscience is showing us that after around 30, between 30 and 40, our neurogenesis, making new neural connections, new neural pathways, basically grinds to a halt. And so we're not actually like making new decisions as much as we're just going with the perspectives and the neural connections that we've already made.
And
And
unless you're like making a conscious effort to change your neural network, right?
right. So, in a lot of ways, we're sort of on autopilot unless we are consciously trying to change through things like meditation or breath work, or, like you're saying, making a conscious effort. So literally we can create new perspectives. New perspectives pop up into our consciousness that we never saw before because we're making those new neural connections. And like if you look at the research that like Johns Hopkins has done on psilocybin, on mushrooms, they literally have like these brain maps where they show before and then during the mushroom experience, and there are exponentially more neural connections happening after and during the mushroom experience. It's why psychedelics are being touted as treatment for things that traditionally have been kind of challenging to work with, like addiction, like depression, PTSD, people with, anxiety, because they've got, their brain is sort of wired in to these certain neural patterns, these certain neural connections, that, the landscape of their mind.
Yeah,
And then
I would
when,
also call that survival. They
mm,
linked up in order to survive whatever it was they were dealing with.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So when we enter these expanded states of awareness through breath work or psychedelics, we're actually giving ourselves a chance to create new growth, to like step outside of those survival patterns that we've been wired into. Because not only is that happening in the brain, it's also like it goes from the brain into the body, right? Into the nervous system. Um, so we actually have the opportunity to step outside of those experiences and create new ones. And so it's, when you like watch Michael Pollan's Netflix, for instance, there's a gentleman on there that, had OCD, like really strong OCD for his whole life. He had this one, mushroom therapy experience, and, completely broke out, was completely able to change the OCD. For myself, like, when I left my marriage, I drank a lot. I was about 40 pounds heavier than I am right now. I didn't eat very good. I smoked pot every day. All those things were ways that I was coping with my emotional baggage that I was carrying around from childhood trauma, complex trauma. My parents got divorced when I was 4, to some things that happened to me as a teenager, to the things that I couldn't deal with in the marriage. And so there was this organic process that happened, because as I started to take better care of myself, I started to say, well, maybe I shouldn't drink, or maybe I shouldn't, eat a whole pint of ice cream, for dessert, right? And
I can relate. That's why I'm laughing.
so you have these thoughts of like, oh, like this isn't good for me, right? But then what's challenging for people is that they try to change, and like there's something that's sort of fighting back, and that can be really frustrating. It's like, hey, how come I can't change this?
It's the
Well,
path of least resistance, right?
yeah,
That you end
right.
up going back to.
Yeah, and it's because your nervous system and your mind is wired with these survival and these coping mechanisms. Like, this is how you've learned to soothe yourself. So, one person soothes themselves through gambling, another one through, sex and the relationships that they get into. Another person is, drinking heavily, or, using heroin, or,
Yeah.
different opiates. It's
Anything that's a
all coming from,
distraction.
yeah, it's all coming from the same source, which is this like internal pain. And that we've learned, oh, this soothes the pain. So, like, as I started to remove those ways of soothing myself, it was almost like I felt like I was thawing out, and all of a sudden there were emotional things coming up, things in my body, somatic, things, as well as things that I needed to like work through with a therapist. And having tools like breath work, like doing ice baths, journaling, all the things that I work with, with my clients on, like to show them like, hey, here are these different ways that you can rewire these systems, that you can create a more positive environment for yourself that you want, that's going to help you create the effects that you want, the changes that you want in your life. But I had to experience that myself. I was like, oh, okay, it's not just as simple as like, cool, I'm just going to stop drinking. Now I've got to deal with what are the things that I was sort of suppressing with the drinking.
Right.
And so it's a
And
process.
and you're, like I said in the beginning, you're healing yourself in order to
Yeah,
help others, because that's like your calling. And so
absolutely.
now let's talk about what you're doing today, because this is a worldwide broadcast, and
Mm.
on the internet it's worldwide. So can people work with you through Zoom or through the telephone? Like, how can you work with people if people want to work with you?
Yeah, definitely. So for both my coaching and my breath work, I do work online with folks. If they're local to Tucson, I do have some in-person clients, but the majority of them are I've connected through the blessing of the internet. So in terms of breath work, not only do I have private clients, but I run group online breath work a couple times a month. And
I
then
saw that you have one coming up on October 1st, right? Are you full or do you still have registrations available?
Yeah, there's still have registrations available. We'll keep it limited just because I want to have an environment where I can support people, and there's only so many people that I can support at one time.
Yeah.
And but yeah, so it's right now I'm running that on the second and fourth Sunday of every month. But yeah, you can reach out to me if you want to learn more about that, or
How
if
do
you're
they
interested.
reach out to you?
Probably the best place is my Instagram. It's Blue Magic Alchemy, but I also put my website on your show page information. It's beacons.ai/Blue Magic Alchemy. Um, so yeah, if you see, I mean, like I have Blue Magic Alchemy is my brand. So, there's a Facebook page, there's Instagram. I actually have a full website that's actually being developed right now. So possibly by the time this airs, it'll be up. But yeah, Blue Magic Alchemy is where you should
And
find me.
people can actually go to your podcast and listen to you on a regular basis. What do you talk about on your podcast called the Vital Point Podcast?
Yeah, so the vital point is all about methods for personal transformation. So we talk about psychedelic integration, we talk about breath work, meditation. We've had some ice bath folks, somatic therapists. But really, the vital point is with all of this is that regardless of the method that you're using, you actually have to practice it. There's this great like one of my favorite Buddhist texts. There's this great line in it, and he says, is it appropriate to blame the doctor if all you do is read the label of the medicine?" So it's not enough to have the medicine and just look at it. You actually have to take it. You actually have to do the work. And like you said, and like you're focusing on with this podcast, as you heal yourself, you heal the world around you. And that's one thing that I've really found with the podcast is that even though these people that I'm talking with are from a variety of different modalities and backgrounds and practices, the thing that's we have in common is that we've all gone through some sort of um, awakening ourself. And then it's not a choice. It's like, well, now I have to help share this with somebody else. Like I have to pay it forward in some way.
I feel
So
that way, which is why I have my podcast,
yeah,
but what I want to do is I'm not actually the practitioner. I want to provide all these different practitioners in a showcase so people can handpick who they want to work with, who they resonate with.
yeah,
And I find that, the work that you're doing to help others as a practitioner is making the world a better place, right? Because
yeah,
you're helping
absolutely.
people heal.
Absolutely. And for me, like especially since, I only went through this journey myself like a few years ago. Um, there's no lack of information in the world right now. Like I'll use Buddhism as an example. Um, Within Tibetan Buddhism, which is like the main thing that I practice, there are unbroken lineages, from the Buddha to this student to that student, that you can trace, right? When Buddhism went to Tibet, it came through India, and there are these lineage holders, these people that traveled across the Himalayas from Tibet to India. It took them multiple years. They risked their life, and they would come back with a few teachings, maybe a couple of things that they found. They would go look for a teacher. It was this incredibly arduous process. Now I can literally open my phone and within a second find those teachings that took them years and they risked their life to find. So the world has changed in terms of the access to information that we have. We have access to so much information. We have access to all these different modalities and teachings and traditions and things that you can use to heal yourself. So therefore, if that's the case, why are we not all like healed? It's not the lack of information that's the problem. It's like people are like, okay, well, what do I do with this? And I know for myself, when I was starting out, when I was poking around and going, maybe this is the answer. Maybe this is the answer. What about this? You know, I was exposed to a lot of things, but a lot of things didn't help me. It was actually hooking up with somebody, going through a breathwork program where I could dedicate myself to, months and months of development, working with a coach, working with, a somatic experiencing practitioner, and like finding people that had, the experience that could help me, not just give me the information. So it's like kind of like the difference between like, you can go buy all the ingredients for like a cake, and try to do it yourself. And, it might come out good, especially if you find like a good video on on YouTube or something like that, right? Some instructions. But if you're working with a master chef, somebody that has years of experience, how much better is that cake going to be?
Yeah.
It might take you time and time and practice to make anything where you're like, oh, this is what I was going for, right? And you know, uh, you might end up like in an I Love Lucy type situation or something where you're adding salt instead of sugar, or the ratio is bad, the cake doesn't rise, or something like that. Whereas if you're working with a coach, with a teacher, you're able to kind of shortcut a lot of that
I
stuff.
call it fast tracking.
Yeah. Tim Ferriss talks about that, like in terms of there's one way of learning, and that's like the 10,000 hours, right? We've all heard that from Malcolm Gladwell of like, it takes 10,000 hours to master something. Well, that's true. And if you could find like a master teacher, how much would they be able to like fast track you? How much would you be able to learn from their experience and them saying like, well, hey, this is the mistake that I made, or this is what I learned as I went through this particular process. So, you don't have to make the same mistake that would be doing over your 10,000 hours. And certainly you still have to do the work, right? You can't just rely on the teacher. But my experience has been like that working with a coach, working with a teacher is, however that relationship feels right for you, has been like the way that I've fast tracked or kind of leveled up. And that's been a lot of my journey this year. Like I 2 years ago, I was trying to do everything myself. I, was like, okay, I want to figure out how to start a breathwork business. I want to do X, Y, and Z. And it wasn't, I was trying to do that all myself. Like I was trying to figure out how I could get what was in my head and what I was practicing on my own and scale it out to people. Well, I'm fortunate enough that I found, a breathwork program, like a facilitator training program that I really resonated with. And I went through that program. It was 6 months where it's like, here's how you do it. Okay, great. Now I don't have to like sit there and stumble through all this myself. And then this year, it's like I've hired a business coach. I've hired a personal trainer. I've hired somebody to help me with my website instead of one of my survival patterns, which is like, I don't trust anybody to help me. I can only rely on myself. And so I'm going to do everything myself, even if it takes 4 times as long. The website is like such a great example because there are things that I've stumbled through that have taken me 8 hours to do. And the professional that I hired that knows what he's doing can do it in 2 hours. So it's like, oh wow, okay, this, it really is worthwhile asking for help.
Yeah,
And
it's speaking of that, and in wrapping up, um, one of the things I've always said is, when you go on a tour of the Amazon, river, for instance, do you want to go with someone who's been there before, who's actually, been through the waters and knows, the experience, or do you just want to go with a guide that's read about it in a book?
right.
So when you're selecting your coach or your support therapist or whatever you want to call them, um, you know, I always think it's more valuable to actually find someone who went through the pain and
Mm.
suffering themselves, because they know, what how to guide you into what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people that are jumping into this kind of arena right now in terms of psychedelics and integration coaching. Um, as these, like the FDA is fast tracking mushrooms and MDMA, the legal status is changing in a lot of different places. And there's a lot of people that are viewing it. I was just talking to somebody yesterday that was talking about how sort of the same experience that happened when cannabis started becoming legal. There's a lot of people that are jumping into it for money, or seeing it as like, oh, this is a
A
opportunity to make,
revenue generator.
right, a quick revenue. And for me, that's not necessarily who I want to work with. Like you said, I want to work with somebody that has the experience, that's gone through it, not somebody that just like jumped in it for other reasons.
Yeah, to
And
add it in their tool belt, right? Like,
yeah,
"Oh, I can
absolutely.
help these people." It's all the same, but
Right.
I don't really think it is. Do you have anything that you wanna share as we wrap up and close out this episode?
No, just like I said, you can go to beacons.ai/Blue Magic Alchemy, or, look me up, Blue Magic Alchemy, on Instagram, Facebook. I do have, a 6-month coaching container that I work on people with one-on-one, as well as a shorter breathwork coaching container. It's right now it's 6 weeks, and it's the scope is much more narrow in terms of like what we go over, but it goes into all different types of breathwork. Because I think we could have just talked about breathwork for this show. It's become such a popular thing, and Wim Hof, who was one of the most famous breathwork folks in the world right now, like has a reality show and has been on Gwyneth Paltrow's Netflix
What is
show.
that? Where's the reality show? Is it on Netflix?
No, it's on cable
Oh,
somewhere. Yeah, I
like
don't have it.
Bravo or something?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have cable myself, so
I
I'm
don't
I'm
either.
limited to Netflix. But yeah, I was, he's been on Gwyneth Paltrow's Netflix show, and I feel like at least once a week I see some sort of news story or magazine article about the benefits of breath work on CNN, on Newsweek, on all these different types of formats and forums. And so uh, you know what does that mean? Like I said, breathwork could be a whole nother podcast in itself, because there's all different types of breathwork for different reasons and different intentions that you're trying to get out of it. And so yeah, that's what my breathwork coaching container is all about. It kind of goes through the different stages of
Can
breathwork.
people go to your podcast and find old episodes where you talk about them?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've got about 45 episodes that are published right now. I'm in the process of recording some new ones at the
Are you
moment.
on Apple and
Yep.
Amazon,
Yep. All the major audio.
Spotify?
Yeah. And I just started moving things off of Instagram onto YouTube. So if you search for Blue Magic Alchemy on YouTube, you can find the new episodes there. But yeah, Anchor, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, just look for the Vital Point. And there's, yeah, lots of information about breath work, about meditation, about psychedelic integration, and a whole lot of other things kind of in the middle of those, like somatic practices.
Well, I can tell you have a lot to share and a lot for people to learn from you. So y'all head over to the Vital Point podcast and learn more about what Jonathan has for y'all to learn about the experiences and the support that he's offering those who are looking for it. So I want to thank you for your time today and just wish you all the best in your journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Great. All right. We'll talk to you later. Just a second. We've reached the end of this episode. If you'd like to continue with this inspirational journey, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out. If you are a self-proclaimed oneness junkie, get yourself a t-shirt and spread the message of oneness in your community. And finally, if you have a story to share or know someone that should be a guest on this podcast, contact us at onenessjunkie.com. See you next time. And remember, when we heal ourselves, we heal the world. Compassion starts with you and me.